The initial perception that something disturbing was happening within the major American metropolises did not arise from alarmist headlines or government reports, but from the urban landscape itself, which seemed to carry a new, heavy and unexpected silence, as if each empty street revealed a truth that no one dared to voice. The promises of prosperity, used for decades as the basis for the construction of national identity, now contrasted with entire areas immersed in abandonment, giving shape to a paradox as evident as it was unsettling, where the glitz of financial centers could no longer conceal the growing depopulation of the regions that once sustained the economic strength of these cities. The collapse did not manifest itself as a sudden explosion, but as a slow, almost imperceptible process, similar to an emotional and structural erosion that seeped into the neighborhoods, corroding the vitality that once defined the daily lives of the residents. While drones and cameras scanned once vibrant neighborhoods, it became impossible to ignore the transformation unfolding before our eyes, revealed by closed establishments, bricked-up windows, disused bus stops, and buildings that had lost their purpose without any official explanation accompanying this decline. There were no sirens, no emergency announcements, no solemn pronouncements. There was only the silent realization that 5 major metropolises had crossed a tipping point and entered a stage of structural decay that no one seemed willing to admit. Within this scenario, an almost uncomfortable feeling arose that the national narrative had omitted something essential, allowing the deterioration to become commonplace, as if it were just another natural consequence of modern life. Given this evidence, one question remains that troubles any attentive observer. Why has no one shown this on television? And why is it that only now so many are beginning to realize what has always been obvious? If this question also resonated with you, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and leave a like now. That way you can follow each new discovery and help this type of investigation reach those who haven't yet realized what's happening. From the moment the first visual evidence began to accumulate, it became impossible to ignore that what was happening in these metropolises went beyond the idea of simple urban decay and took on the contours of a systemic process of emptying out, perceptible both in physical structures and in social behavior. In cities like Detroit, Philadelphia, San Francisco, Portland, and Baltimore, each in its own way, the same pattern repeated itself with unsettling precision. Shops closing down with no prospect of reopening, commercial buildings remaining closed for years on end, transportation hubs gradually losing passenger flow, and entire neighborhoods that seem to exist only as vestiges of a more dynamic past. The absence of movement represented not only economic decline but also the end of a community logic that once defined the rhythm of these territories. Official statistics insisted on presenting seasonal market variations, suggesting that economic fluctuations could explain the phenomenon. However, the streets told a different story, built from the sum of small signs that together formed a portrait of progressive collapse. The growing lines at assistance centers, the increasingly constant presence of vehicles used as makeshift housing, the expansion of high-risk zones, and the closure of schools due to lack of resources functioned as silent indicators of a reality that was consolidating before anyone willing to observe it. Even so, most media coverage treated the situation as local peculiarities, avoiding recognizing the existence of a pattern that connected these cities in a similar trajectory. This contrast between official discourse and what was revealed in public spaces fueled the feeling that something deeper was underway, giving shape to the question that was becoming inevitable. If the symptoms were so evident, why did almost no one talk about the real cause? As evidence accumulated, the need arose to understand why different cities, with such distinct histories, economies, and social profiles, showed almost identical signs of deterioration, as if obeying a silent logic operating behind the scenes. The most superficial interpretation attributed the decline to temporary economic factors, such as market fluctuations or demographic changes, but deeper analyses revealed that the events did not result from isolated circumstances, but rather from coordinated decisions made in spheres far removed from the affected communities. The movement of large corporations, real estate funds, and financial institutions demonstrated a territorial reconfiguration that transformed entire neighborhoods into disposable areas, not due to an inability to recover, but due to a lack of interest in preserving them within. A system that profited from abandonment. This logic, often obscured by technical discourse, operated through a subtle cycle. Companies transferring operations to cheaper regions, governments relaxing regulations to attract new investments, banks expanding their control over distressed properties, and investors waiting for the complete devaluation of certain neighborhoods to acquire them at ridiculously low prices. Meanwhile, the local population faced an increasingly unsustainable environment. Pressured by service cuts, rising cost of living, and loss of opportunities culminating in forced migrations that left cities even more fragile. Amidst this process, the media adopted an ambiguous role, sometimes downplaying the severity of the situation, sometimes assigning diffuse responsibilities that prevented an understanding of the real mechanism. When analyzed together, these elements suggested that urban collapse was not merely a consequence of neglect, but part of an economic reorganization model that used the fragility of cities as a strategic component. This finding raised a disturbing point that became impossible to ignore. If the collapse was beneficial to some, what other consequences were still being deliberately kept out of public debate? When the effects of this process finally surfaced, it was no longer possible to treat them as isolated movements or behavioral fluctuations typical of large urban centers, as the transformations observed in the Five Metropolises made it clear that the impact went beyond the economic sphere and extended irreversibly to social, cultural, and structural dimensions. The constant increase in vacant properties, the bankruptcy of small businesses that historically sustained neighborhood life, and the replacement of residential areas with deserted regions created a scenario in which the feeling of belonging was gradually replaced by a collective displacement responsible for weakening community ties and compromising the basic routine of thousands of families who depended on these spaces to build their identities. As schools closed due to lack of funding, hospitals reduced staff, and essential services were compromised by decreased revenue, a domino effect emerged that affected increasingly wider segments of the population, resulting in food insecurity, precarious housing, and the accelerated growth of makeshift communities in parking lots, abandoned land, and old structures that no longer served any defined purpose. The reduction in public investment exacerbated the visible degradation of the streets, while migration to rural areas or smaller cities introduced a new demographic imbalance, aggravating tensions that did not previously exist and contributing to the emergence of pockets of poverty far from traditional centers. With the weakening of urban infrastructure, a cycle of deterioration formed, fueling local instability and amplifying the perception that these cities might not recover their lost vitality, even though emergency programs were presented as attempts to reverse the situation. Amidst this scenario, an inevitable question arose, capable of directing attention to the next layer of this hidden phenomenon. If the consequences were already visible at this point, what kind of emotional and existential impact was silently creeping into modern life? Although the material impacts of the collapse were striking in their magnitude, the deeper dimension of this process emerged from a less visible, yet equally decisive layer, built upon the silent perception that modern life, even amidst technological comforts and constant flows of information, had become incapable of providing the sense of emotional stability that once arose naturally from community relationships. The atmosphere of large metropolises began to reflect a kind of collective fatigue, perceptible in the spaces where crowds used to gather and which now exhibited an almost symbolic emptiness. A result not only of economic deterioration, but of a gradual distancing between people and the environments that, for decades, had been considered pillars of urban identity. In areas once characterized by conviviality and movement, the constant presence of apartments illuminated by screens, silent squares, and vehicles that served simultaneously as shelter and transportation reinforced the idea of a society that, even surrounded by resources, was emotionally exhausted, incapable of maintaining the cohesion necessary to face a changing context. Progress, which had promised to expand the feeling of freedom, seemed to have contributed to increased disconnection, creating a routine in which an excess of stimuli coexisted with a scarcity of human connections, leading many residents to imagine that fleeing to rural areas could represent more than a geographical fresh start, functioning as an attempt to recover their own ability to breathe calmly. This combination of physical abandonment and inner exhaustion fueled a growing perception that true collapse wasn't restricted to decaying structures, but was silently settling into daily life, as if each repetitive gesture revealed a life compressed by invisible pressures. From this point, it became inevitable to explore an element that transformed this feeling into something even more concrete. The numbers revealed the depth of the crisis, numbers that rarely reached the public eye. Do you want to continue? As the emotional surface of the collapse became more evident, the need arose to confront the data, which, despite being available in small reports and little-accessed public documents, rarely gained space in the national debate, revealing a quantitative picture that confirmed the depth of the phenomenon taking hold in these metropolises. In different regions of the country, research institutions indicated that the number of people dependent on food banks exceeded levels recorded in historically critical periods, while surveys on indebtedness showed that a large part of the adult population lived with levels of default capable of compromising entire decades of financial stability. Parallel to this, the exodus of residents from large cities grew steadily, driven both by job losses and the need to reduce expenses amidst a cost of living increasingly incompatible with disposable income. These data, when analyzed together, revealed a strikingly stable trend. Schools closing not due to a lack of students, but due to a lack of resources. Hospitals reducing services in the face of increased demand and dwindling funding. Local business networks disappearing as large conglomerates took control of the few remaining economically viable areas. In many cases, entire neighborhoods faced simultaneous declines in safety, health, and income indicators, forming a statistical mosaic that would be sufficient to trigger national alerts had there been institutional interest in exposing the gravity of the situation. The choice to treat these numbers in a fragmented way contributed to maintaining a distorted public perception, as if each city faced isolated problems that had nothing to do with the ongoing structural transformation. However, when observing the continuous line that connected all this data, an inevitable question arose. If the statistical dimension of the collapse was already so clear, what else was needed to reveal the impact that was approaching on the horizon? Want to move on to the next one? By gathering the visible signs, the social impacts, and the consistently accumulating data, a scenario emerged that went beyond simple urban deterioration and took on the contours of an irreversible process advancing at a steady pace, indicating that the collapse observed in the 5 metropolises was not an isolated episode, but the first stage of a much broader phenomenon. The combination of population decline, the fragility of local institutions, and the inability of public investment created the perfect conditions for other urban centers, still considered stable, to begin exhibiting similar symptoms such as increased internal migration, silent economic contraction, and the gradual replacement of traditional neighborhoods with expanses of unused land accumulating without any prospect of recovery. The most evident risk was not only the physical decline of cities, but the speed at which this process became normalized, allowing the population already accustomed to successive crises to fail to perceive the gravity of the ongoing structural change. The slow erosion of daily life transformed into a type of collapse that did not produce major announcements or immediate shocks, but which, precisely because of this gradual nature, acquired enough force to compromise entire areas before there was an opportunity for intervention. Local governments, pressured by debt and loss of revenue, adopted palliative measures that did little to alter the overall picture, while the private sector continued to direct investments to regions where the return was more predictable, leaving vast urban areas to their own devices. This dynamic revealed that the future of metropolises was not threatened by extraordinary events, but by the continuation of a model that favored the silent extinction of entire spaces raising a fundamental question that led directly to the next point of analysis. What did this progressive collapse say about the very essence of humanity and about how entire societies reacted when confronted with the feeling of imminent end? Want to move on? When all the layers of this phenomenon finally overlapped, it became evident that the collapse of the 5 metropolises transcended the urban dimension and directly touched the emotional essence of a society that, for decades, had linked its sense of stability to the idea of continuous growth. The silent streets, the abandoned buildings, and the weakened public services ceased to be merely indicators of structural deterioration and began to represent an uncomfortable mirror, reflecting the fragility of a culture that prioritized accelerated progress without questioning the human cost embedded in this movement. This realization revealed that the true impact was not only in the physical fall of the cities, but in the gradual loss of the collective capacity to perceive when their own way of life had become unsustainable, allowing emotional emptiness to set in long before the visible ruin. This perception provoked a kind of unease that spread silently, reaching individuals who, even far from the 5 metropolises studied, recognized in the signs presented an anticipation of possible futures for their own cities. The collective feeling of vulnerability arose precisely from the understanding that collapse depended not only on economic crises or misguided governmental decisions, but on a long chain of daily choices that, accumulating, shaped the destiny of entire communities without their inhabitants realizing the magnitude of the changes underway. From this understanding, it became inevitable to reflect on the shared responsibility of observing and questioning the transformations that were occurring before their eyes, even when these transformations presented themselves discreetly, camouflaged by the accelerated routine that characterized contemporary urban life. Amidst so much evidence, the viewer was left with the understanding that comprehending this process was essential to anticipating its future developments and recognizing that no society remains immune to gradual decline, which is why the inscription becomes